Well, thank you for watching. This is what I ended up saying last week at the podcast show 2023. A lot of people have asked me for the slides, so here are the slides, and indeed what I ended up saying next to them. I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News, your daily update for podcasting and on demand, and it's great to be here in London. I live in Australia now, I said, but I was born just down the road in Hammersmith, and I've lived here for many years, and it's great to be back to see how much London has changed. When I was born in London in the early 1970s, the UK had an unpopular Conservative government. Energy prices were sky high, everyone was on strike all the time, and astonishingly, we weren't even part of the European Common Market. How things have changed, you must be very proud. Now, we're here to take a look back at the last 12 months and look forward to what kind of industry we want to work in. So firstly, I thought it was time to play a little game. Yes, it's time for Think of a Number. I'm going to show you a set of numbers, and hopefully you'll recognise the numbers more than you recognise this TV show from the 1970s. That's Zoe Ball's dad, by the way. Does anybody know what these numbers are? Obviously, I can't necessarily check whether or not you know what these numbers are, given that this is just a video on YouTube, but they are the year-on-year increase in podcast ad revenue posted by these companies for the last quarter. With BuzzFeed closing much of its operations, Vice Media filing for bankruptcy, and many media companies having a pretty poor time, certainly in the US, it's worth reminding ourselves that ad revenue from podcasting is still increasing. In fact, in this country, podcast ad revenue last year grew by 32%, according to the IAB in the UK. In the US, the IAB says podcast ad revenue is growing faster than all other forms of online advertising. And when I gave this speech, the IAB in Australia were due to release their new numbers the day after. So they appeared too. I seem to remember that the IAB said that podcast advertising was up by more than 20%. Now, of course, podcasting hasn't been immune from economic uncertainty. In the US, many great people have lost their jobs, but in Europe and in the UK, it seems that we're hearing less bad news and more good news from podcasting. We've seen consolidation in France, with Paradiso Media buying Binge Audio just this month. Denmark's Podimo continues to grow, with content deals with a number of companies here and elsewhere. Swedish company PodX Group is investing heavily in podcast companies across Europe and Latin America. And the last year has seen a number of standout podcast successes here in the UK. The Newsagents from Global, The Rest is Politics from Goalhanger Productions with Acast, PodSave the UK, one of the biggest launches we've seen in a while from Crooked Media and Reduced Listening, and Diary of a CEO, which last week became the first independent podcast to be available on the BBC iPlayer. All of these are great examples of my first point about where the industry should be going in the future. Make more shows people want to hear. It's not rocket science, really, is it? These shows and many more are driving new consumption too. New figures released this month by Radar in the UK showed the number of people who listen to podcasts has grown dramatically over the last 8 years. But I'm now more interested in time spent listening. And unlike the US, here, time spent listening to podcasts is on the increase per person. And now more than 91 million hours of podcasts are consumed every week in the UK. So as we mature as an industry, perhaps one thing we should focus on is engagement, time spent listening, rather than pure audience reach. It's this figure that we can affect with content by making more great shows that people want to hear. And it's this number, more than any other, which helps our financial success. When Adam Curry and Dave Weiner invented podcasting in the early 2000s, starting with this blog post from Adam in early 2001, which led to a meeting in a New York hotel with Dave Weiner, a software engineer, they built podcasting to be open. No gatekeepers, no commissioners. There's still something magical about the fact that podcasting allows anyone to be on the platform next to anyone else, even the podcast from Adam and Dave themselves, Trade Secrets, which I was thrilled this year, with Adam and Dave's permission, to bring back to podcast apps everywhere. And today, I can tell you that I'm working with Dave Weiner to bring back Morning Coffee Notes. That's his solo podcast with more than 100 episodes, and that'll be available later this year. There's lots of really historic interviews in there, but let me play you a short bit from April 2005. This is Dave Weiner in the rain, overlooking the sea.
It's April 30th, 2005. Man, you should see what I was seeing. And it's pouring, absolutely pouring outside. And it's lightning like every couple of seconds. Of course, it's really humid. Oh, wow. Oh, here we go. I wish you could see it. You can't see it, but I bet you heard that. Woo!
Now, last July, Michael Mignano, one of the co-founders of Anchor, wrote a long piece saying that what Dave Weiner worked on, RSS, was hindering podcasting because you can't change the RSS standard. And he was wrong, because just like HTML and other standards, you can enhance and improve it. And it's been enhanced and improved throughout podcasting's history. Just as one example, podcast thumbnails weren't Dave's idea, and they aren't in the RSS spec. They're an enhancement from Apple. But who's enhancing RSS today? Well, Adam Curry, and a different Dave, Dave Jones. The new podcast namespace in what they call Podcasting 2.0 adds new features to RSS files while still being compatible with all existing podcast players. Now, creators can publish transcripts and live captions for their shows, making them more accessible, but also enhancing targeting for advertisers. Podcasters can add a funding feature to their shows, allowing the audience to directly give money to the shows they listen to, in addition to advertising. Comments, live chat, and even live shows are all supported, and, more ambitiously, the new podcast namespace could reinvent how podcast creators or even musicians earn their money. Over the last year, we've seen a new breed of podcast players that support these additional standards, these enhancements to RSS. One of the biggest and best known, Fountain, is from here in London, and they've released a new version this week. Open podcasting can do all this, and open podcasting means no central host to upload to, no central index. We have hundreds of podcast hosting companies, and it's still possible to host your own show on your own servers, as I do. There are thousands of people working in ad tech, in advertising sales, making podcast apps and services. Podcasting was built to be open. But over the last few years, we've seen some threats to open podcasting, and perhaps the biggest threat in the last 12 months. Apple and Spotify, while they have increasingly proprietary parts of their platform, still use RSS feeds, the bedrock of podcasting. The whole infrastructure of podcasting relies on the RSS feed, from discoverability to dynamic ads, to podcast hosting companies who all encourage and educate new creators every day. Now, YouTube has added podcasts, but unlike Spotify and unlike Apple, YouTube has no reliance on the RSS feed. No need for analytics companies. YouTube does that. No need for podcast hosting companies. YouTube does that. No need for advertising companies. YouTube does that too. Indeed, in Pod News today, as an exclusive, we will publish details of YouTube's upcoming support for RSS. There's no pass-through, no dynamic ads, indeed, no ads at all. YouTube requires all podcasts on their platform must be ad-free. They sell the ads, not us. So much for open podcasting. But YouTube aren't alone, with BBC Sounds, Denmark Radio and other companies pulling some of their podcasts away from open platforms and forcing audiences away from open podcasting. So let's be open about what this means to our industry and work together to defend open podcasting. And finally, work together on everything. Not just that, we're still a small industry and we will continue to grow. So while you're here, go and see organisations like the Podcast Academy. Support new initiatives like Publishers in Podcasting, announced last week from Acast, The Guardian, the FT, Tortoise and others to champion audio journalism. Look at the success of Radio Centre in the UK at raising the profile and revenues of commercial radio, and ask ourselves whether a collaborative podcast centre or podcast advertising bureau could continue to help us grow. But in all of this, work together. It's what makes this industry unlike any other. I'm super excited about being here this year. There is so much to see at the podcast show, from the exhibitors who are here to the more than 350 speakers you'll find across all the different tracks, to the live recording of the Pod News Weekly Review in this room tomorrow at 4:15 p.m. Quick plug, I think it got away with it. Listen, have a great show. And most importantly, keep listening.